So I'm marking the sword profile out on the wood, and then I'm marking around the blade about a 1/2 inch out. So the sheath will be about 1 inch wider than the blade is when it's finished. And that'll give the wood a little bit of an area to have a spot where the edge can rub up against without cutting through the sheath. And it'll also make it so I can glue the pieces of wood together, because it's going to be 2 pieces of wood carved out and glued together and then wrapped with leather on the outside and lined with leather on the inside. The little Sharpie dots there are just some reference marks that are about a 1/2 inch away from the sword edge. So I just drew a couple of them in there and then kind of freehand in the pencil. And then I'll refine it later to make sure the tip's kind of what I want it to be. Right now it just needs to be something that I can go by and cut the piece off roughly on the bandsaw. I ended up extending the tip out a little bit further because the radius on the end of the sheath required the tip be a little bit bigger and a little longer, so I just lengthened it out just a little bit. Now I'm just cutting out the outline of the sheath. Tie my light back out of the way because it hangs right over where the grinder is, and the sheath's really long and it's gonna run up into the bulb and break it, so I had to pull it back with wire a little bit. Picked out a pretty straight piece of wood. I went through like all the wood they had at Lowe's and picked out a couple pieces that were pretty good, but it still had some curves and warp in it. Yeah, I got one piece roughed out and put it over the piece and cut out another one, so I have the 2 halves that I can start hollowing out on the inside so the blade fits in. I super glued the 2 halves together just with 2 little tiny dots just so I could shape the pieces together. It was basically just to tack them together and hold them in place so I could shape them both the same. Getting the profile fine-tuned a little bit more on the grinder here, which was kind of hard to do with this thing because it's over 3 feet long, so it's kind of hard to get it all straight on a little 8-inch flat area that I have on the grinder. The little super glue tacks held together really, really well, and it was actually pretty hard to pop it apart with those 2 little drops of super glue on there. I'm marking out the area that needs to be carved out now for the blade to fit in. I needed to oversize the slot for the blade quite a bit so I could put the lining in there too, because the lining leather was about a 1/16 inch thick, so I needed the slot to be about an 1/8 inch wider than the lining. I thought really hard about how I could carve out the inside of the sheath and ended up deciding to start out by using the round wheel on my grinder. But yeah, I thought a bunch. I thought of doing everything from just hand chiseling it out to angle grinders to using the table saw. But the main things I ended up using were the 2x72 inch belt that you see here with the round wheel to get some of the rough stuff out. And then I used the angle grinder to kind of fine tune the edges where I couldn't really get in there with the round wheel. And I used the chisel just a little bit too. It's a little scrap piece of leather to see if it fits in there okay. I ended up using that piece a bunch as I used the angle grinder to make sure I was getting the proper depth. Ended up going too deep and had to rework it a bunch to get the sword to fit in there just right, but I didn't know that at this time. I thought I was getting the right depth. I had a lot of wood to work with as far as thickness, so it was okay. I was able to just thin it down later with the planer. So yeah, don't be afraid to use unconventional tools to do something for you, because I'm just using an angle grinder here on wood, and it works pretty well. It kind of burns the wood a little bit, but not too bad at all. It's just a regular grinding wheel, like 36 grit grinding wheel for metal, and it worked really well for what I wanted it to do on the wood, to kind of make that nice sharp stop where the leather would come up against the edge of the sheath. It's not normally a tool that you would think of for working with wood, but it worked really, really well. Definitely a lot quicker than chiseling it all out by hand. I started chiseling a little bit here and there just to clean up some of the spots and smooth them out, but mostly the angle grinder was able to do it. I had to use a chisel a bunch on the very tip though, because I couldn't quite get the angle grinder in there. Didn't take too long though. It only spent like 25 minutes or so on the tip area with a chisel. It was kind of fun cutting out those little chips. Here, I had my leather skived in half, so that what that means was the leather was really thick. They ran it through a skiving machine, which is basically like a bandsaw kind of that splits the leather in half and made it thinner. So the piece that I was using on the front and the nice half with all the good texture on it was about 4 ounce, and then I was left with like a piece that was rough on both sides that was like 4 to 6 ounce. So here I'm using one of the rough scraps that they skived off to kind of fit the sheath together and see how the sword fits in there. It ended up being kind of misleading though, because I thought the good leather that they split and the bad leather was basically the same thickness, but it's actually a little bit different. Like this rough leather varied a lot more than the good piece, so I ended up not getting the sword to fit how it needed to be with the proper leather that was in there. I made a pattern with tape of the sheath. I just put a bunch of layers of blue tape in the sheath and then cut it out, and that gave me a really good pattern to go by for cutting out the actual leather. I decided to go ahead and use the leather that was going to go in the sheath at this point with the really nice smooth texture on it instead of that rough split part. So I'm cutting those pieces out now because I realized the rough split part really wasn't the same thickness, and I needed to be using the actual piece of leather to fit the sword. I thought it was too tight and too loose and ended up doing a whole bunch of stuff, and in the end it ended up being really, really tight, and had to leave the sword in the sheath for a couple days in order to get it to where it would go in and out of the sheath okay. While I was fitting the sword, I had to glue the leather in each time to make sure it was up against the surface of the wood really well. Although in the end it didn't end up mattering too much because it didn't quite fit how I wanted it anyway. So I kept gluing it in and taking it out and hammering it in and fitting the sword and clamping the pieces together and taking it out and shaving some wood off in the planer, and kept doing that over and over again, and I still didn't quite get the fit to where it needed to be. I just used a little bit of contact cement, so I was able to pull the leather out without too much problem. Shaving some thickness off because the sword fit kind of loose at that point. Although it was probably just about right where it needed to be, but I didn't know at the time. I had to trim a little bit off the leather here and there too, because as I put the piece in and hammered it all down and took it out and fit the sword over and over again, the piece of leather stretched a little bit, so I had to trim a little bit off the sides to get it to fit back in there properly. The sword ended up fitting a lot tighter after I wrapped the sheath with leather and sewed it up, because it really pulled the wood together more than my 3 clamps were doing. I needed to put the sword together to start fitting the part where the guard touches the sheath, because the sword guard has this point to it, so couldn't just make the end of the sheath flat. It needed to come to a nice point, so there was a lot of fitting I had to do there too. I think I needed to take some more out of that pointed area and just keep fitting it over and over and over again until it fit how I wanted. I actually wanted to make it so that right where the point comes, right in the center of the guard, that it didn't quite touch the wood there, but it touched the wood on the rest of the area, because when I wrapped the leather around that, the leather was going to be a little extra thick right there just from having to stretch so much. That would fill up that area a little bit. So I wanted to make sure on the wood there was a tiny, tiny bit where the tip didn't touch, but the rest of it did touch really well. That ended up being the right call, because when I got the sheath done, it fit in there just about perfect all the way down into the tip area too. And when I say tip area, I mean the tip of the guard. Had to mess around with the planer a little bit. As it turns out, the planer only goes down to like 1/2 inch. I thought it went down further. So I had to ask Dad about it, because it was his planer and he's had a lot more experience with it than I did. And we ended up taking the other board that I had, flattening it out and sticking the sheath, the half of the sheath onto that board so we could plane it down thinner than 1/2 inch. So that's why you see this big board and the sheath part going through at the same time. It's finally time to round the edges and make it more of a scabbard shape instead of just this weird rectangular long chunk of wood. I put quite a bit of radius on the edges, on the corners, and it gently goes over into the broad, wide area of the sheath just a little bit. It's pretty flat still because of how thin the sheath is though. Definitely wanted the edges nice and rounded. Now I'm hand sanding the radius just a little bit to smooth it out because I just did all that sculpting on the round wheel and there's some little gaps and not gaps, but little low spots and high spots and stuff. So I just got some 60 grit sandpaper here and I'm going over it just to smooth it all out. Probably not really necessary, but I wanted to make sure that little dimples in the wood didn't show through on the leather after it was put on. Shaking up some Masters contact cement. I believe that's the brand, yeah. Normally I don't need to shake it up, but I put some thinner in it. It needed shaking up a little bit to mix it all in. Wrote Kyle Royer Mastersmith First Sword 2019 on the inside. No reason, because hopefully nobody will see it ever. Here I'm putting in the liners, and this will be the final installment of the liners. At this point, they shouldn't be coming in and out anymore since everything's rounded and stuff's getting ready to be put together. And to work the leather over the ends of the sheath, which was really hard to do because it's got that pretty extreme radius on there from the part where the guard meets up to it. So it was hard to get the leather to stretch that much around there, but it did pretty good. I'm using a Sharpie to dye some of the areas of the wood black that could possibly be seen after the leather's put on. Shouldn't be seen, but I just wanted to make sure that if there was a little tiny gap in any of those places that you wouldn't be able to see the bright color of the wood. Getting ready for the final wrapping of the outside parts now. Lots and lots of contact cement was used. I used almost that whole can on this project because there's a lot of surface area. So I ended up putting like 2 thin coats on the wood and 2 thin coats on each piece of leather just to make sure I got it on there really good. Most of the time, if you do the process just right with the contact cement, it sticks so well that the leather actually tears apart before the contact cement lets loose. Trimming up the edges where the leather folded over. You need to get it nice and flush to the wood so the pieces match up really nicely. Getting ready to do a final test fit to see how the sword fits in there now that it's all glued together. So I'm clamping the pieces together with some tape wrapped around really tightly. I think at this stage the sword fit really well, but I didn't realize later in the process with more tape on there it was actually going to fit really tight. I'm putting a little bit of mineral oil on the leather just to help protect the blade later when the sheath is all done, or the scabbard rather. Marking out the edge, or right next to the edge where the stitching will go. It's easier to do this now before I put the pieces together. So go around the leather where I need to do all the stitching and just kind of indent a little bit of a line. I'm just seeing how well the super glue holds to the wood. I'm using some really, really thick super glue here. It actually holds really, really well, so I decided to go ahead and use that on the sheath. The wood actually rips apart before the super glue lets go. Plus the sheath is going to have stitching all the way around the seam that'll really bind it all tight together. So I got it super glued together and put a bunch of tape on it really tightly to hold it and let it dry. Time to start laying out where all the stitches go. I have the lines there that I drew, but I still need the little stitch marker to space out how far apart each stitch will be. So that took me a little while to go all the way around the sheath and do that. So I've begun the long, long journey of stitching this thing up. This thing has nearly 7 foot of stitching that needs done. 6.5, 7 foot. And I'm about an inch into it so far. Each hole needs to be auled out from 2 sides, sometimes multiple times in order to get them to connect. One at a time as I go along. And then I'm doing like a saddle kind of stitch with this butt seam where you go in from both sides with the needle, 2 different needles. So I've got 1 needle on each end of the string. Go through one way, take the other one, go through the other way. And then pull it all tight like that. That's pretty much the stitching, and I gotta go all the way down both sides of the sheath, and then I'm probably gonna go around the throat area too. This is kind of sticking up, but later on I'll take some gum tragacanth, whatever that stuff is, and I'll rub it on here and take this little piece of antler and rub the seam down. It'll get it to lay down a little flatter and close up a little bit. This thing took me forever to stitch up. It was a really, really slow process going in there and doing each different hole at a time. I started doing like 4 holes at a time, but just doing that took a while, and then doing the saddle stitch, butt seam, whatever thing, I don't know what you call it, but yeah, that took a long time, using 2 needles, going through each hole from each direction. I think I spent nearly like a 11-hour day just stitching that sheath, and it was painstakingly slow. It felt like using some waxed thread. I took the bulk of the wax off by kind of scraping it across a sharp corner, just because I didn't want the wax to get all over and make a mess. Got all the stitching done and started burnishing the seam where the leather comes together, just to get it all laid down as flat as possible and to get it nice and shiny. I was really happy with how well the leather really closed up at the seam, and then the burnishing just finished it off to where there's just barely even a noticeable seam there at all. And then one of the last things to do here is just to do the finish coat. So I'm airbrushing on the leather finish. This was the first coat. I think I'm gonna do like 2 or 3 altogether, and let it dry in between each coat. And then I think this thing can be finished. I may have called it a sheath just now again. And just substitute sheath for scabbard anytime I say that. So the sword, like I said, fit extremely tight, like way too tight at first, because of just stitching that all the way around, pulled the pieces of wood super tight together. But after leaving the blade in it for a couple days, it kind of wore in the leather a little bit, and it fits in there just perfectly now. Thanks for watching me work on this scabbard. If you enjoyed the process of working with this leather and wood, then leave a like, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.